What is the most besieged city in history? It's Byzantium, and it's not even close. From its inception as a Megarian colony all the way to the modern age, it may have had different names, but it's always been the same city. And it has been through a total of 36 sieges. At least, that's the amount I've counted. That's a lot of sieges. So I thought it'd be interesting if I go through every siege, explaining what happened in brief detail. Buckle up. At this point in time, Byzantium was little more than just an isolated, tiny Greek city-state. When the Achaemenid Persian Empire decided to expand into Europe, little Byzantium's fate was doomed. The Persian forces utilized both their army and navy and successfully conquered the city. Some 30 years later, it would be the Achaemenids' turn to be on the receiving end of a siege. In 478 BC, a series of Greek city-states, numbering in the hundreds, formed the Delian League, an alliance made to fight the Persians following the Battle of Plataea. This time, the Greeks were the ones besieging the city through their navy, and also being successful. It's the Peloponnesian War. Athens is fighting a coalition led by Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes. I don't want to talk too much about the war because if I did I would never finish this video, but what you need to know is this. At the tail end of the war, specifically between 410 and 406, Athens won a series of victories where they recovered much of their empire. This was thanks, in large part, to Alcibiades. In 408, this Alcibiades joined the siege of Byzantium and a portion of the hungry citizens agreed to surrender the city. But the garrison was so fanatically loyal they fought to the bitter end. Still, Athens was successful in reconquering the city. Philip II is the king of Macedon and starts a war with Athens. Although the Athenians would eventually lose the war, they won in this case. Philip II eventually gave up on sieging Byzantium to fight the Scythians along the Danube. The death of Lysimachus had left a hole in the Danube. With no one protecting the shaky border, a Gallic people, as we later came to call the Galatians, invaded the Hellenic world, and one of the cities they sieged was Byzantium. Eventually, Bithynia played mediator, and as a result, the siege was lifted. Next to try was the Seleucid Empire. Byzantium was receiving support from Heraclea Pontica and, most notably, Ptolemaic Egypt, and ultimately, the Seleucid siege of Byzantium was unsuccessful. This one's a little uncertain. Certain sources, utilizing Cicero and Tacitus as a reference, argue Byzantium was, in fact, under siege, while others say a siege was planned but ultimately didn't happen because of a storm. If it did happen, then this siege occurred during the Third Mithridatic War, and the one sieging the city may very well have been Mithridates VI of Pontus, but it was unsuccessful, so say the sources. At this point, Byzantium is no longer an independent city-state. It's actually difficult to pinpoint exactly when it happened, but the city found itself under the hands of the Roman Empire. At this point in time, the city hadn't been besieged in nearly 3 centuries. So what broke the record? Was it a barbarian invasion? No, it was a civil war. What started as a 5-way dance had been reduced to 2 men. On one hand, Pasquinius Niger, commander of the Eastern Legions. On the other, Septimius Severus, sitting emperor and commander of the Pannonian legions. The two would clash in Anatolia, where Septimius Severus won, and the coalition led by Niger was dismantled, with only the tiny city-state of Byzantium remaining as a Niger loyalist against Severus. After all, how long could it possibly take before this tiny, irrelevant backwater is retaken? It took him 2 years. Septimius Severus wasn't very happy with it and ordered its walls demolished, though he later relented and allowed its walls to be rebuilt. The next 2 sieges happened during the period known as the Tetrarchy, when the Roman Empire was ruled by 4 emperors ruling at the same time. This system was made to safeguard against both foreign invasions as well as civil wars, and it worked pretty well. Until the creator of the system, Diocletian, stepped down. Almost immediately, the Tetrarchs began fighting against one another in a series of civil wars. In one of these civil wars, Maximinus II, ruler of the East, invaded the territories of Licinius, who was ruling over the Balkan region of the Roman Empire. Maximinus II actually took Byzantium with relative ease, though he would ultimately lose the war to Licinius, who would rule over the eastern half of the empire with the west belonging to Constantine. Which leads to... Constantine and Licinius were allies for as long as they had enemies on their respective side of the empire. As soon as they got rid of their rivals, their relationship began deteriorating almost immediately, though things weren't finished between the two after a civil war. Constantine was the clear winner of the first conflict, however, Licinius was still in a good enough position to remain in power. However, second time would be the charm for Constantine. Licinius eventually holed up in Byzantium and proved to be a handful to Constantine. He eventually managed to take the city. By that point, Licinius had escaped to Anatolia. It didn't matter, Constantine still won. This second siege may have very well changed the history of Byzantium. Constantine had a direct contact with the city and experienced himself the difficulty in taking it, or its value on how easily defensible it is. Constantine eventually made it the new capital of the Roman Empire, calling it New Rome, though eventually its citizens decided to name it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. With these changes came new defensive walls, making the city even more difficult to take. From this point onwards, things changed for Byzantium, or Constantinople in this case. Before, it was difficult to take the city, but still perfectly possible, but with its defensive upgrades, including one that's about to come, taking the city without treachery became next to impossible. The first ones to experience this was the Goths, who, following their victory in the Battle of Adrianople, tried besieging Constantinople, and they failed, badly. After this, in all the sieges, Constantinople would be protected by a new set of walls, very famous for their name: the Theodosian Walls. The Theodosian Walls were an instrument of protection, just like the sponsor for this video, Atlas VPN. The Theodosian Walls protected Constantinople for 1,000 years. Atlas VPN protects your privacy. Country-restricted content on my YouTube? The power of a click. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount. It means you can get a 3-year subscription for just $1.99 a month with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so get your deal by clicking the link in the video description below. It is the best VPN deal on the market right now, as Atlas VPN is much more than just a simple VPN, capable of blocking malicious links, ads and trackers, and notifying you when someone is trying to steal your data. Think it's slowing down internet connection? Nope. It is speed reincarnated. It allows you to save money while shopping online, enabling you to have the best deals possible. All those geographical restrictions treating the average customer like an animal locked in a cage, gone, with just a simple click. And of course, it protects all your devices with just a single subscription. Again, click in the description down below for a discount. It's a special deal of $1.99 a month for a 3-year subscription with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out, so what are you waiting for? Get the best possible deal for Atlas VPN right now. Now, where was I? Something about the Theodosian Walls? Oh yeah, the Huns. Something I feel is noteworthy of mentioning. Though in 448 Attila came to Constantinople, he never actually tried sieging the city. All he did was take one good look at the walls, and that was enough for him to go away. At this point, we're well into the Byzantine age, and the first ones to try to take the city were both the Sassanids and the Avars, with the first on the Asian side and the other one on the European side. Because the Persians could not move their siege equipment into the European side of the Bosphorus, this siege failed. The Arabs had happened, and the Byzantine Empire lost about half of its territory. In 654, the Rashidun Caliphate actually attempted to take Constantinople, but was thwarted by a storm. I should emphasize, however, that this siege may not have actually happened. This time, the ones attempting to take the city were the Umayyads. They also failed. The Umayyads would make a continued series of attacks that would last for either 3 or 4 years, but again, they would fail to take Constantinople. The next siege would be the first successful one since Constantine himself took the city from Licinius. A civil war would occur as the Opsikian team rebelled against Anastasius II, successfully taking the city and enthroning Theodosius III. Ironically, it was the Opsikian team that had installed Anastasius II in the first place. The Umayyads are back, baby. Once again, they failed. This siege is probably the most famous siege of Constantinople, except the last one, and 1204. mostly because it was the debut of the Greek fire, aka medieval napalm. The Byzantines used it in order to defeat the Umayyad fleet, which left its army abandoned in Europe with dwindling supplies. The Bulgars then took the chance to join in on the action themselves, defeating the Arabs either encamped or those who strayed into their lands. The Bulgars would be the next ones to give their shot. They failed. Thomas the Slav was a Byzantine commander in the 9th century, who led a revolt against the sitting emperor Michael II. He tried taking Constantinople but failed and was then killed shortly after. The peoples trying to take Constantinople this time around are the Rus, taking advantage of the empire being preoccupied with a war against the Arabs and raiding the suburbs of the city. Jury is still out whether or not the raids were the end of it or if the Rus actually tried taking the city but failed. Once again, the Rus tried sieging Constantinople, this time by Oleg of Kiev. Things were ultimately settled with a peace treaty. The next 3 sieges would be attempted by the First Bulgarian Empire. They all failed. The Rus for a 3rd time, this time under the leadership of Igor I of Kiev. The attempt ended up failing, but Igor ended up mounting a new, larger force, so the Byzantines decided to settle things diplomatically. Leotomicus was a Byzantine general during the 11th century. Think of him as kind of a Thomas the Slav, seeing as he also failed and was killed shortly after. Time for the First Crusade. In truth, this was less of a siege and more of a skirmish, which resulted in the palace of Blachernai being ransacked. Things were settled when the Emperor Alexius Comnenus arranged for the Crusaders to be booted off to Anatolia, where they could actually do some crusading. This is where everything starts falling apart. So far, most sieges on Constantinople failed, and the ones that did succeed didn't seriously damage the city. But that's about to change. This siege was done by the Fourth Crusade. Yes, that crusade. But it wasn't made with the stated goal of sacking the city. At this point, the Crusaders were only acting in favor of the previously deposed Emperor Isaac II, with the goal of putting him back on the throne. They broke through the defenses, reinstating Isaac II as Byzantine Emperor. When he died though, the populace erupted into revolt, deposing the pro-Crusaders Alexius IV, which led to... This event is frequently pointed as the moment the Byzantine Empire was doomed. Though I am inclined to disagree with this sentiment, I can definitely see why some people think that. In short, the Crusaders took the city, looting it, vandalizing it, and destroying it for 3 days. When the aftermath settled, they just straight up declared the city was theirs now, proclaiming the creation of the Latin Empire. After 1204, the empire was divided. Though the Crusaders had taken Constantinople, proclaiming their new Latin Empire, resistance against the invaders formed, but it was not united. What followed was some 60-odd years of conflict between the Latin Empire and the successors to the Byzantine Empire, the Empire of Nicaea, the Empire of Trebizond, and the Empire of Thessalonica. In 1235, in a joint effort alongside the Bulgarian Empire, John III, Emperor of Nicaea, tried taking Constantinople, but the siege was unsuccessful, and they were forced to pull back for the winter. Though they agreed to continue the siege next year, when push came to shove, the Bulgarian Emperor refused to send his troops. By 1248, the Empire of Nicaea had managed to achieve control over the land surrounding the city. This attempt to besiege the city is implied by a Byzantine historian, but there are no details known, meaning it may not have actually happened. I can only assume it was yet another attempt by the Empire of Nicaea, which failed. The Empire of Nicaea would try again, to no avail. Though the Latins had managed to push back the Nicaeans yet again, this would be the last time. Not even a year later, and the city had been recovered by the Byzantines after a scout force had managed to re-enter the city under the cover of darkness. Even though the Byzantine Empire had become a thing again, the truth is it never recovered from the blow of the Fourth Crusade. At this point, the Byzantine Empire was reduced to little more than just a regional power, who would often fall under the sway of foreigners. A civil war between Andronicus IV and John V led to this siege, where Andronicus IV had the support of both the Ottomans and Genoa, which allowed him to successfully take the city. The final sieges of Constantinople always had the same power trying to take it: the Ottoman Empire. This was the first attempt, which was aborted after news came of a Hungarian attack on Ottoman lands, forcing the Ottomans to settle with the Byzantines. This was in practice a long blockade with the aim of starving the Byzantines to submission. There was even a Western attempt to relieve the siege, known as the Crusade of Nicopolis, but it was defeated by the Ottomans. What ended up saving the Byzantines this time around was the invasion of Timur of Anatolia, forcing the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid to lift the siege and face Timur in the Battle of Ankara, which Bayezid not only lost, he was captured. This led to an Ottoman civil war, which even allowed Byzantium to recover some of its territory back. During the Ottoman Civil War, one of the Ottoman princes, Musa Çelebi, launched an attack on the city. Pressing matters elsewhere meant he had to call it off. The second to last siege of Constantinople was, once again, lifted. The attacker was the Sultan Murad II, who had to go somewhere else specifically to deal with his brother's rebellion. And here it is, the final siege, the fall of Constantinople. To be fair, it had been coming for a while. The Byzantine Empire had long been reduced to a glorified city-state at this point, and only due to outside factors the city had remained unconquered. This time, there would be no intervention. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II had made sure of that. The siege lasted 53 days, and when it was over and the Ottoman troops finally broke through the walls with the help of literal cannons, it spelled the end of the Byzantine Empire. An institution which lasted over 1,000 years, but if one is to believe the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire are one and the same, then 2,000 years. Constantinople became the capital of the Ottoman Empire and has remained under the hands of the Turks until this day. Today the city is known as Istanbul. It has a population of nearly 16 million people, making it the most populous city in Europe. Thank you so much for watching this video. Leave a like, comment, and if you're not subscribed, then by all means, do so. I'd really appreciate it. I also have a Patreon if you wish to support me there. This was Spectrum, and I'll see you around.